everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you. We're here for another conversation discussing F.A. Hayek's seminal work, The Road to Serfdom. Kevin and I are doing this whole series for those of you who've been watching, but last week we did chapter 7, Planning and Totalitarianism. And this week we're doing chapter 8, Economic Control and Totalitarianism. Thank you, Kevin. That was fast. That was good. We have this Word document. Dude, yes. That was awesome. That was good.
We're actually, there's a Word document. So I have two screens up, Word document on this side. We're playing Pong on this side. And there's a whole bunch of stuff happening. I'm up 5-3 anyways.
Okay. Again. So for those of you who missed last week or whatever, we're just going to kind of recap a little bit of it. Largely because, as I've said before, and will continue to say, is that so much of this book is Hayek laying just layers of an argument and building, and it all builds and builds on itself. And so last week he talked about economic control and totalitarianism, like I said, but basically the theme of last week is you have these people called planners. We've defined this before, but what planning is basically another word for socialism or top-down government control or all these bureaucracies and stuff, dictating, it's the opposite of a free market. It's instead of you deciding, what you want to buy or how much of something you want to produce or whatever, and at what price that you want to sell something at, it's these planners dictate all those things for you. So Hayek lays out this thing about how, well, one of the things the planners will do is say, why don't you just let us take care of the economy? Like, this is a boring thing. No one wants to worry about it. Like, who cares about the production of these things? Why don't you just let us take care of it? And this is a pretty, I guess, for some people, compelling argument when Hayek was writing this, originally in the 30s and then in the early 40s. And so what he does is lay out this notion that, look, as soon as someone takes over the means of production, it's not just one little aspect of life, it's all of life. And that actually economic freedom is a prerequisite for all other freedoms that we have in life. And that by economic freedom, it's like, just think about even just any good or service. I think one of the examples we gave was maybe like cheese or milk or cows or something like that, about how if the government controlled just cows, just the like cattle farms, then they would control the supply of food, of beef for every restaurant, leather for every person who would use that to make different things. They would be controlling the land, for all of these sale barns and stuff. They would be controlling any place that would need milk for cheese, or just need milk, or, sour cream or ice cream or whatever. And so that's just one thing. And the planner gets to decide, well, how important do I think it is that people are able to have ice cream? Or how important do I think it is that these places can sell steaks or whatever, just in this one situation? But when they control the entire economy, well, one of the inputs into the economy isn't just the goods, but also the services. It's the labor that we have. So if a planner controls the economy, what starts out is like, just let us take care of the production of stuff and, all of these things. Then it's, well, they're also going to have to dictate how many of certain kind of occupations we need. How many of certain kinds of this do we need? We've decided we need more people over here making this thing. So we're going to need more steel workers or whatever, even if people don't want to be steel workers. And so all of a sudden it goes from this little sliver of society to, oh, well, now they control how much of anything that you can buy, because they're controlling the production of it. They're controlling how much you have to even spend, because they're controlling your job, and they're controlling where you live and who you live around by controlling where you live, and so on and so forth. And so it expands and expands and expands. Just from this one thing, and even just, I think if I remember right, we talked a little bit about how they'll say, just let us take care of this one thing. And, it turns out that there's big overlap. And like one of the examples just contemporary is like, well, what if someone said, just let the COVID, like, don't worry about COVID. They'll just let these scientists or these experts just worry about the virology. Okay. That's not going to impact your life. It's just let them worry about the virology. And it's like, well, no, but it's closures and how many people can be in a room, and can you be out driving at a certain time, or how many people can come over to your house, and covering your face, and can your kids go to school, and so on and so forth, or
and
can
even
you go to a restaurant.
And even the infallible Biden at the time, which he took, like, why are people worried about economics right now? You're just worried about your bottom line. You're just worried about the stock market, stock price. Like, you're worried about all this stuff, and there's a pandemic out there killing people. Well, it's like kind of the reverse end of what you just talked about. Is like they think economic life is over here and health and safety is over here, and these things are not interconnected. So that's the problem with having these narrow-minded experts just tunnel vision at the thing that they believe is going to best benefit society as according to their plans.
And it's going to end up overlapping with everything else, and it's going to end up, coming into conflict with my plans and your plans and everyone else's plans. And then it's like, well, who decides? Which sounds like it might be a little bit foreshadowing of this chapter. But so that's chapter 7, and chapter 8 opens up with this really great quote by a guy named Lord Acton, who is a 19th century like kind of philosopher dude. He was born. I was wondering, I thought he was older than de Tocqueville, but he's younger than de Tocqueville by like 30 years. Anyway, so this quote is great. The finest opportunity ever given to the world was thrown away because the passion for equality made vain the hope for freedom. And that quote to me, I was telling you earlier, I was at a birthday party for a couple friends earlier tonight. And one of them said, "What are you reading? What are you thinking about?" This, this is the types of conversation my friends have. It's like, what's your mind into lately? And I said, well, F.A. Hayek, but he's quoting this Lord Acton and Alexis de Tocqueville a lot. So I'm trying to get into these guys. And it's just crazy, how you go back and just see how, I thought I used to be blown away by hearing Thomas Sowell talk about, debunking the wage gap in the 70s. And now it's like, oh, John Stuart Mill and Lord Acton and de Tocqueville and F.A. Hayek, like it goes back. It's okay. It's the early 20th century. And then actually, no, it's the early 19th century in a lot of cases, I think On Liberty was maybe published in the 1850s or 40s, something like that. I know it was before the Civil War. It might have been 50s. Anyway, and so it's like, that's just how all these ideas are. But this idea that the finest opportunity, and what he means by that, you can tell me what you think. But it's like this opportunity in terms of having a free society, like the road not to serfdom, the road to liberty was thrown away because people wanted this total equality, and they weren't worried about the freedoms they would give up in the process. And it's just, it makes me really sad to see how true that is, today, probably 150 years later.
Yeah. I mean, I think people look at this as such a baffling idea that there is such a thing as human nature. And that, some people believe it's completely fixed. Some people believe it's completely malleable. And then, people, I would say in the middle, believe it has bounds. You can fit between those bounds. And it's people like this, like Lord Acton, which, like you brought up before, all these old names from all the old timey days when pictures were still black and white, I think back then. It seems like one side has a lot more reverence for those people than the other ones, because progressives must progress. They must progress and transcend all those old timey names and those old timey ideas. They worry about blowing by them instead of actually learning from them. Or they'll point out like, oh, well, they probably believed in slavery or something, or that something that almost everyone believed back in a certain time, or some version of that. And they discount all of their ideas. So not having that reverence, really, really hurts. But so when they talk about going and disbelieving the idea that there's a human nature, I think that's where this equality over freedom thing comes, because they believe with more freedom, we're naturally become more equal, right? Because we're all equal in some capacity, or a free society is going to be more compassionate towards certain ends that are going to allow people to have more equitable outcomes, because we want no one to fall behind. So I think that is where, we really stem off of freedom and the path toward liberty or toward liberalism, and move toward, well, we got to plan something. So some people falling behind. We don't like how society's turning out for some people. So I think we need to get this a more planned structure. And like we've talked about before, a lot of the planners think there is chaos in absence of a plan. And the problem there is, well, there's always a little bit of chaos in the system, which is a good thing, because too much order leads to rigid hierarchies. But allowing people to make their own choices, which is kind of that little piece of chaos there, they could develop their own plan. And in a real true society, and like what you read before, that making your own choices is this very liberal idea is a prerequisite to all other freedoms, even if it's just in the economic sphere. Yep. That you have to be able to make your own choices, so you can create your own plan rather than have one person build, one entity build a plan for everyone and create this hierarchy of ends.
Can I go on a very small tangent based on what you just said? Because I had a thought. So you just said something that I think is actually like kind of worth playing around with a little bit. So that's why I say that. Where you said like chaos is a small amount of chaos is a good thing. Ian Malcolm, Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park, he's a chaotician and talks about chaos and how it's not necessarily a bad thing. I was thinking about the concept of, just evolution of society, evolution of humanity, or even of organisms, and how all of that comes out of chaos and chance. There has to be chance. And
randomness, at least a little
exactly.
bit. Exactly.
Yeah, precisely. And just because if you look at the progression of a lot of progressive thought, I know people will trace some of this stuff all the way back to the very early 1800s. But if you look at like modern progressivism and planning specifically, there's a very large chunk of that kind of came right after basically Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, and you get people who they finally have this idea of, okay, we can actually be done with God, we can be done with this, and humans can be this perfected thing and plan these perfected societies. And the irony to me is that part of what emboldened them, was Darwin's and Darwinian thinking and Darwin's philosophy, which basically said that things are going to be always developing and you're always going to have this chance, and you're going to have a natural evolution and allow for these things to happen, for there to be different iterative games, and for the successful games to rise to the top, and the games that don't work out so well to be discarded. And the implication of having a planned society and removing the element of chance is my point. You're saying you need chaos. When by removing that, is they're basically saying we are perfected. There is nowhere farther for us to go. We cannot do any better than this. We have nothing else to learn. We have nothing else to build or invent, that we can just stop the process of societal evolution right here, right now, and we can be in charge. And the hubris required to do that is just, there's a quote later that we might get to by John Stuart Mill. And there is a quote that actually he opened with by John Stuart Mill in one of the other chapters about
let's get to that John Stuart Mill, because it doesn't fit nice and neatly in everything else.
Yeah.
I think we could probably just jump to that quote right now.
I like that. Yeah, let's read it. So Mill says, I stopped at a different one. Scrolling down. We have so many notes, guys. You have no
doing it live.
Doing it live.
Found it.
You found it? Okay. A fixed rule like that of equality might be acquiesced in, and so might chance or an external necessity, but that a handful of human beings should weigh everybody in the balance and give more to one and less to another at their sole pleasure and judgment would not be born unless from persons believed to be more than men and backed by supernatural terrors. So to break that down, he's saying, look, like a fixed rule, like equality, so even something like that could be acquiesced in, and so might chance or some other external necessity. That's fine, just as a general idea. But he's saying, like, look, the idea that a small handful of people would be able to judge and weigh everything in society just based on their own opinions, no one could possibly do that unless they believe themselves to be more than human and backed by some supernatural terror, like some delusion, some crazy thing. And the John Stuart Mill quote from earlier in the book is when he basically says no one could be trusted less to run a society than the person who thinks they could actually do it. That's the last person you want in charge, is a person who thinks they could actually do this. And so, yeah, I mean, I know that's just an aside, But it is mind-boggling to me, when you think about the people who want to control all of these aspects of our lives, the people want to make these totalitarian COVID measures, or, the Green New Deal type stuff, and do all this stuff, and remove that element of chance from things and just say, okay, let's lock it in here and we'll be in charge. It's just dangerous. It's dangerous. And not only is it destructive, but it's just, that person is so fundamentally delusional and so fundamentally beside themselves with pride, maybe without even realizing it, that they are, regardless of their intentions, they are literally the last person you would want to trust with even an inch of authority over anything.
Yeah. Yeah. When the mill quote that's backed by supernatural terrors, for some reason, every single time I hear that, I don't know if you've watched Game of Thrones or, a fan of Game of Thrones, but there's this very religious group that's kind of modeled after Christianity, I imagine, because they're the ones who believe in the single powerful God. And the chant that they almost quote all the time is, "The night is dark and full of terrors." And what they do is they'll burn people at the stake to offer them up to God. And so to me, it's like these people are a good idea of what it looks like for someone who has a plan and will do anything to make sure that they can fulfill that plan, including burning people at the stake. And they chant, the night is dark and full of terrors. Well, they are the terror. They are the people that you should be watching out for. When someone says they can come in and control your life better than you can, manage your life better than you can, or if they offer you something for free, because guess what? Nothing is for free.
Yeah.
Beware of those people, even if they're nice people, even if they're well-meaning people. Most of them, again, give them the credit and say, I believe that you want people to live a better life, live their best life. But by controlling them, there's no avenue to get there, because there's just too many people to do that. And in the end, it's that choice, the freedom of choice that you get to enjoy your own life. I think it gets a little bit into this chapter as well, that when choice is taken away, even if, something good, even if you're given a great position of power, once something's taken away from you or something does not turn out, it's better to feel like, okay, maybe, by random chance, this thing didn't work out, or maybe I wasn't good enough to get this thing to work out. But it's a lot worse when it's someone else, a third party that when it took that away from you, and they're
all
the ones.
part of the plan.
Exactly.
As the Joker would say.
If it doesn't fit in the plan, it doesn't go. So
that's right. Anyway, that's an aside. Sorry, but it I don't know. It's just a thought I had.
Should we get into the chapter? 20 minutes in?
I said let's call it there. Yeah, for sure, man. Wait, what's the name of this chapter?
So the name of the chapter actually comes from a phrase popularized by Lenin during the early years of the Soviet Union: whom. Now, I've always talked about how the chapters are really labeled perfectly, and it really gives you kind of a succinct idea as to what it means. When I first read this, because I'm not familiar with that phrase, I'm like, I have no idea. This is the first bad call here, Hayek. I'm gonna go now and write a bad review of this book. But no, the further you get in and understand what whom means, it's like, oh wow, spot on. So whom is seen as kind of the universal problem of a socialist society. So, quote, who plans whom, who directs and dominates whom, who assigns to other people their station in life, and who is to have his due allotted to others. This became the central issues to be decided by the supreme power. So the idea here is, if there's a supreme power out there, if you give this large coercive power to the centralized authority, they're going to be deciding these things, right? So it's extremely important to understand these people are going to run your life. It's not going to be limited to any economic sphere. It's not going to be limited to a small part of your life. It's not going to be limited to just healthcare. It's not going to be limited to just basic necessities like food and clothing and shelter. It's going to have to run your life. It's going to be who plans whom, who directs whom, who dominates whom. So I think it's a really, really apt way to start the chapter and really label a chapter overall, because these are the ideas he plays around with throughout chapter 8.
Yeah, and Lenin, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Lenin was one of the early leaders of the Soviet Union, communist guy here. So this is of all the planners, one of the planniest of them all. This is a guy. And so the fact that he understood, and this at the end of the chapter actually gets into this, is that, in all fairness, with all due respect, however much could be due to the Nazis and the fascists, Hayek says, at least they understood where their ideology leads. And so they just jumped right to the need for total control. Like they didn't try to pussyfoot around like that's not what was required. And Lenin's one of those guys who understood that pretty well.
Yeah. They took the Autobahn to serfdom. They went there real fast.
It's the Autobahn. Well, I thought the construction on that was halted during World War II.
It was, yeah. It didn't fit into the plan at the time, when they're at war and losing.
There's an Easter egg to the very first episode. Anyway.
Nice.
Anyway.
So to continue on the chapter, so this is like the first sentence right after the original Lord Acton quote that gets into it here. And he doesn't really mention this much throughout the chapter, but I like the idea here of relating, a sphere of economics into something else that we're familiar with, but we'd all agree on that this thing should probably remain the same. So to get into it here, quote, "It is significant that one of the commonest objections to competition is that it is blind. It is not irrelevant to recall that the ancients' blindness was an attitude of their deity of justice." So what I thought that was interesting here, because you think of the Greco-Roman goddess of justice, who goes under a lot of different names. I tried to figure out what name it was under, but there's a couple of them, but there's always depicted as blindfolded. It has the weighted scale there. It's got the blindfold over the eyes. And the reason is because justice must be blind. You do not want to build arbitrary laws or arbitrary decisions inside of, the law. When you're trying to say or sentence someone to really take accountability for what they did wrong in society and the laws that they broke, you don't want to do it arbitrarily and say, all right, well, I like this guy, so he's going to do this thing. I don't like this guy, he's going to do that thing. I don't like white people, so I'm going to send them here, but I like this other race, so I send them there. We've seen what arbitrary law, especially in the criminal justice system, has done in the past. And we don't want the same idea, which everyone agrees that it must be blind, although that's being less and less agreed upon, I suppose, now. But I don't know why we don't apply the same idea to competition, just competition in the general market, that it must be blinded without a central plan directing everyone's activities. Because, once we take the blinders off and once we say, all right, we're going to be directing a central plan by this coercive authority, that is when arbitrary laws are implemented. That is when this big authority picks winners, picks losers. And, the only way that you can come out on the winning end, the only way to guarantee you come out the winning end rather than just outworking everyone else, is to really suckle up to the party in power and say, I'm going to be a party person. I'm going to be, well, not a party person in a fun way, but like a party advocate, and make sure, I do everything I can for the party. And that's what makes these fanatical true believers.
Yeah, I mean, he even talks about earlier in the book about in the chapter on the rule of law, I think it is, where he gets into the socialists and the Nazis hated the rule of law. They hated blind justice because they wanted certain outcomes. And that's one of the things that Hayek gets into, and maybe even earlier than that chapter. I think it is in that one though, actually, but where he's like, to the degree in which you would want to know how a law might impact one group over another, you want it to at best be a coin flip. Like you want that to be the degree of certainty you have in that thing. And he's saying that this is the thing that they have problems with, right? Like so much of this stuff is common sense, to be honest. Like the fact that people might not like blind justice is that's a red flag. And just look at all of the things today that these people talk about where it's like, maybe we should do segregation in the name of inclusivity. It's it
goes back to the John Stuart Mill quote that we just read. It's like, what kind of godly power do you think you are that you should have the authority to dictate the ends, especially in the rule of law?
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly right. So, and that's just one example. These people want to do it everywhere. Yeah. Anyway, so moving on, just kind of the case that Hayek is laying out here and explaining what happens whenever a society enters that stage of the who, and people are starting to ask these questions and figure this stuff out. He says, the fact that the opportunities open to the poor in a competitive society are much more restricted than those open to the rich does not make it less true that in such a society, the poor are much more free than a person commanding much greater material comfort in a different type of society. Although under competition, the probability that a man who starts poor will reach great wealth is much smaller than is true of the man who has inherited property, it is not only possible for the former, But the competitive system is the only one where it depends solely on him and not on the favors of the mighty, where nobody can prevent a man from attempting to achieve the results. And what he's saying here is, like, let's say we have a society. I think, isn't it one of the other chapters, gosh, where he gets into like moving, it might also be the rule of law, where he says we'll move into a rule of status, right? Where it's basically creates this new aristocracy. And so it's like, let's say I'm rich and I'm in a society where I have no freedom, basically. And I, like you were saying, I'm part of the party or whatever. It's like, how stable is my wealth and my comfort? It's like, it's incredibly unstable. It's incredibly unstable, because if I gained it from the planners, it's like Job, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, right? So if my wealth came from the planners, then they could take it away arbitrarily. That's how that works. And Hayek is saying, like, look, even in a free society, the fact that a rich person, who started out wealthy, has a better chance of maintaining that wealth by the end of their life than a person who's poor. It's only in the free society where the poor person can actually achieve wealth, completely as a result of his own pursuit of it. And which is much more stable. It's much more stable than just like a person hands it to you and then at any given time they could take it away. And so it's like, that's one of those things that it's hard to wrap your mind around for a lot of people, because in the short term, Sol does such a good job of saying you got to think about time as a factor. And so a lot of these people say, well, the lower class or the bottom 10% or the top 10%, it's like, this is a constantly shifting group because of time. And so, yeah, someone who's poor at a certain point in time in their life, it's like, yeah, that might suck, but we don't know what the end of their life is going to be. Right. And so, and it's only in a free society where they have the highest probability of not just achieving wealth, but achieving stable wealth, much more than if they were in some type of restricted or planned society.
Yeah. I mean, it's obvious that one will have the advantage over the other at the beginning, but no one knows the end. And it's only in a free market society that that person at the lower end of that economic spectrum can gain access to the upper end of the economic spectrum through his own means. And there's just a lot of movement that allowable in a free market system, because there's a big difference between, and I don't want to get into this too much, but there's a big difference between socialism and capitalism, the way that they're labeled. Capitalism is not an ism at all. It's a description of behavior. It allows people to trade freely and you get to do whatever you can in that system. And that system also allows you, like, if you want to build a commune in a free market system, you can build a commune. You can have a little subsection of socialism as long as everyone freely agrees to it within capitalism, but you can't do that in socialism. You cannot free market trade in socialism because it does not fit within the plan, right? But with a lack of a centralized plan, if you want to get together with a bunch of people and create your own sub plan, that's totally fine. But the other part that an observation that he makes, and it's going to get into the next quote, is that the poor man in a free society is still tends to be way better off than a richer man in an unfree society, because that richer man has to answer to this public authority, where that free man, even though is poor, relatively poor, doesn't have that person to answer to. So that allows for just a lot more range and the ability for that poor man to find more meaning than the rich man, who only has this restricted, narrow scope in which he's allowed to act in. So I mean, we always talk about that when it comes to, there's a lot of classes or groups of people that are relatively poor in America compared to other groups of people, right? But when you compare those relatively poor groups to similar groups in other countries, it's like, well, they're wealthy and they're every poor person seems to have an iPhone in America, and it's awful compared. Some of the conditions are really bad compared to the richest people in America, but compared to the rest of the world, it seems pretty good. And that's the whole point of a free market, is to lift all ships. And we want all ships to be lifted. And then when we start to make that plan to only focus on certain ships and sink other ones, then you build chaos. That is truly, ironically, by creating a plan, you inject a whole bunch of chaos into the system.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. An example I thought of is, people can probably map this onto two stories they're probably at least a little bit familiar with. So take, one story of someone who's at the bottom in a free society, and one story of someone who's at the bottom in a not free society. So let's think about like the movie, which is based on a true story of what Chris, can't remember what his last name is, The Pursuit of Happiness. Will Smith plays him. I think it's Chris something.
Yeah.
And he's at the bottom. I mean, the dude's got his son. He's in subway bathrooms, staying there, but he works his way up, and just through his own hard work is able to actually get a job and end up being very successful. That guy's last name is going to drive me crazy. I'll think of it eventually. And then let's take another story that people are pretty familiar with. Cinderella. What was Cinderella's ticket out of poverty? The benevolence of a prince. Did she have any chance of making it out of poverty? Or her sisters? Why were her sisters so ready to go up there? Everyone wanted to get in line and say they were the girl from the ball, because those people had no other way out. You were born into squalor. You were going to die in squalor. That's it. Unless those who were in charge of society just deemed it so. And then they could also throw you out if they were done with you. I'm done with you. You're done. You're going to go to the stocks. You're going to be destitute. And so those are two, obviously one of those is a fictional story, but that was the reality of someone living, in medieval times or under aristocracy, which is planning is kind of that, right?
Exactly that.
And so, yeah. And so it's like, those are two things where it's like, yeah, it sucks to be, Will Smith's character, Chris something. I keep thinking like Chris Redfield. I'm like, that's a Resident Evil character. Not even close. Anyway, and so, or Chris Parnell, like also not the same thing. Great voice actor, but not. Anyway, but it sucks to be him then, but at least he had a way out. Cinderella's sisters, or whatever, like, yeah, they suck. They were jerks, but they kind of had to be because the plot needed it to happen, but there was a lot, like let's say they're perfectly reasonable and pleasant people. It's like they had no shot of getting out of there unless something like that happened. And so that's, that might be contrived. I don't think it is, of just kind of explaining.
I think the lesson
between those societies.
The lesson of Cinderella is you can make something out of nothing as long as you're hot. And honestly,
you have talking birds.
Yeah, exactly. Just need a little bit of magic, but I think that's a good point, and kind of funny that our free market system, which so many people say is so wrong because it forces women to believe that they have to be sex objects in order to get far in life, whereas you have the story here that you literally have to be a sex object to get far in life because you have no other options. Yeah. One system allows for these other options, allows for this choice, and if you are underprivileged in the very 21st century sense, the way we talk about it now, there are other things you can do to better your own situation. Like, there's not just one choice. There's an abundance of choices.
Yeah.
And a freer society gives you a more variety of choices.
Yep. I had to look it up because I don't like looking stuff up. It's Chris Gardner, but I knew it would have distracted me for the rest of this thing. If I was just sitting in my living room, I wouldn't have looked it up, but Chris Gardner. Okay. So there's the next part of this quote I think is great. And we don't have to linger too much here because it's going to be very similar to the 6-minute conversation we just had. But there's something in this that, again, like so much of these ideas ring true today. But Hayek continues that previous thought about the differences in those societies, where he says, it is only because we have forgotten what unfreedom means that we often overlook the patent fact that in every real sense, a badly paid, unskilled worker in this country, meaning Great Britain, has more freedom to shape his life than many a small entrepreneur in Germany under Nazi rule at the time, or a much better paid engineer in Russia. Who will deny that a world in which the wealthy are powerful is still better than one in which only the already powerful can acquire wealth? And so there's so much here, but this idea that we've forgotten what unfreedom means, I can talk about that forever. Just the generational impacts and changes here. People alive today do not know what freedom really is or what it can purchase for you as a currency. And that's why they're so readily, just willing to give it away. Again, to go to COVID.
It's kind of like you can't see the forest through the trees. It's like you're just surrounded by freedom. You don't really know what it is, or you're not going to know what it is unless you find out what the absence of it means.
That's exactly right. It's the fish saying what's water. But outside of that, quote is so important, where it's like, think about these two options: a world in which only the already powerful can acquire wealth, or one in which, hey, look, if you happen to be wealthy, you're also powerful, because that's how wealth works. But at least in that situation, people who aren't wealthy can also acquire wealth and therefore acquire power. That's the Chris Gardner versus Cinderella thing right there. Anyway, just prescience just oozing out of every pore here. I don't really know what else to say about it, but it's just like, these are the things where they just all feel like mic drops. It's like, I don't think much exposition is needed from the quote, "We've forgotten what unfreedom means." Like, like,
I think people are frustrated because they look at the wealthy and like, I have such little chance and opportunity to become that wealthy. I have such little chance and opportunity to become Jeff Bezos. But in the system that a lot of these people are advocating for, there's no chance.
Zero.
There's no chance. Your chances have been taken out. So it doesn't fit within the plan, then you're not going to acquire wealth. So yeah, I love that quote. And really comparing our circumstances to people and societies that don't have what we have is a good kind of benchmark to understand what you have. There's no way to understand it unless you can actually do that competently. So he gets on to the next part, which he's name dropped the guy Max Eastman several times, I think, in this book so far, but I don't know much about him, but I do like how he kind of goes through the progression of the guy's a communist. So, it starts out, it is pathetic, yet at the same time encouraging to find as a prominent and old communist as Max Eastman rediscovering this truth. So he kind of walks through, it's like, oh, here's this guy who is a communist sympathizer, or really an old communist. And he's starting to see the light, which if you've met a lot of the planner types, they don't like to lose grip on their reality, their version of reality very easily. So when someone does, it's kind of like, oh, it's their red pill moment. I guess Max Eastman would be red pilled, although red
sounds like he was already pretty red. Yeah.
Yeah. Red pill might have a different meaning back in the Soviet Union sympathizing days. So, so Max Eastman was quoted saying, "It seems obvious to me now that the institution of private property is one of the main things that have given man that limited amount of free and equalness that Marx hoped to render infinite by abolishing this institution. Strangely enough, Marx was the first to see this. He is the one who informed us, looking backwards, that the evolution of private capitalism with its free market had been a precondition for the evolution of all our democratic freedoms. It never occurred to him, looking forward, that if this was so, these other freedoms might disappear with the abolition of the free market." Even Karl Marx himself had to recognize that the freeing democratic power of free exchange and the ability to own property led to more of these freedoms. He thought this advancement in human social evolution would continue after the abolishment of the free market, without considering the new forms that stemmed out from free market, free exchange would disappear by removing that scaffolding. And this is a really common idea that I don't want to just point everything to the left, because this book is not just about leftists, but I think it's a problem with progressivism in general.
Sure.
Because like I said before, they so easily forget the roots of what gave them the ability to speak freely, the ability to communicate efficiently through all these, social media forums. And, everything should be free, or at least, healthcare should be free, because we already have all this great medicine. Like, well, where did the medicine come from? It came from somewhere. It came from people freely choosing to create this good and make a profit on it. They think by getting rid of this stuff, those incentives, that human progress that we've made up to this point is just going to continue. And that is really the most damaging thing that Marx kind of believed in. And it's kind of weird because, like Max Eastman says, he identified this. He's one of the first people to identify this free market as a precondition to all of our other democratic freedoms, that he's like, well, we abolish it and we're just going to keep riding the wave because it's not going to end. Well, no, that wave's going to crash into a dam and it's going to stop. And now you're absent of all these great democratic freedoms that we've earned up to this point. And now it's going to go straight to tyranny, which is why, why Cuba is in a constant revolution, because they keep having to relearn this, that you get rid of this free exchange, this free range of choices for your people, and you go down and you devolve into totalitarianism extremely quickly.
Yeah. I want to go back, because what you just said ties into a quote from chapter 2.
Way back.
Right. where he says, with the success grew ambition, and men had every right to be ambitious. What had been an inspiring promise seemed no longer enough, the rate of progress far too slow, and the principles which had made this progress possible in the past came to be regarded more as obstacles to speedier progress, impatiently to be brushed away, than as the conditions for the preservation and development of what had already been achieved. And so that whenever you're talking about the medicine, that's what made me think of is where it's like the people who were like, we already have all this medicine, we already have all this technology, we already have all this infrastructure. Like, it's like they saw the mechanisms that created this stuff not as things that created it, but as barriers. And so they just don't, like you were saying, they don't think about where this came from. It's like none of what we have came out of what they're proposing. There's probably a reason for that, and it never has. None of what we have has ever came out of what they're proposing, right? None of the good things. None of the good things. If there's always going to be universal, like, things that are bad, okay, I get that. The next quote actually directly addresses that. But it's like none of the good things we have came out of their stupid ass ideas. It came out of the ideas that they are just so recklessly and pridefully wanting to just cast aside because they see themselves as superior. So that quote, the next one that it actually goes perfectly with is, Hayek says, look, there will always exist inequalities which will appear unjust to those who suffer from them, disappointments which will appear unmerited, and strokes of misfortune which those hit have not deserved. And so this is where he's getting into, by the way, the source of pain and suffering. All right. So that's this progression here. It's like, well, when the planners are in charge, when everyone's in charge, where do we point to for inequalities and disappointments and strokes of misfortune? So he continues, inequality is undoubtedly more readily born and affects the dignity of persons much less if it is determined by impersonal forces than when it is due to design. The unemployment or loss of income, which will always affect some in any society, is certainly less degrading if it is the result of misfortune and not deliberately imposed by authority. However bitter the experience, it would be very much worse in a planned society. Their individuals will have to decide not whether a person is needed for a particular job, but whether he is of use for anything and how useful he is. His position in life must be assigned to him by someone else. So this is that continuation of the economic argument where now they're just controlling everything. And it's not just they're deciding whether or not you should have 5 flavors of ice cream, or again, James Lindsay's been using this example a lot lately. Well, there's 3 hats in Soviet Union. Well, we don't need a 4th, right? It's do we even need you and your labor and what you can provide at all? Because the planners are taking control of everything. And Hayek continues, he says, in a planned society, we shall all know that we are better or worse than others, not because of circumstances which nobody controls, so chance, that chaos, which is the same force for our growth. It's the same chaos as where it can bring us down and bring us up. A buddy of mine found $100 at the grocery store yesterday. All right, extrapolate that out. That's good luck. Extrapolate it the other way, bad luck. And it's like, look, it's better in society that we know that we're better or worse because of that type of thing, chance, and which it is impossible to foresee with certainty, those events. It's better to have that than to know that we're, doing worse off because some authority wills it. And our efforts towards improving our position have to aim not at foreseeing and preparing as well as we can for the circumstances over which we have no control, but at influencing in our favor the authority which has all power. And this harkens back to this quote from chapter 7 where he says, nothing makes conditions more unbearable than the knowledge that no efforts of ours can change them. And even if we should never have the strength of mind to make the necessary sacrifice, the knowledge that we could escape if only we strove hard enough makes many otherwise intolerable positions bearable. And so Hayek is saying, look, in this society where the planner takes total control of everyone's life and their vocation and all of these things, like the only out they have, like you said, is sucking up to the people in charge, is trying to gain the favor of the new aristocracy, these wise philosopher kings. And I think there's a hidden nugget of knowledge there, and I'll end it here in what he says, where he says, look, if people are in control of our lot, our efforts to improve our position have to aim not at foreseeing and preparing as well as we can, which is another way of saying like improving ourselves, working hard on the situation, right? Doing something productive would be like the reduced version of that, but instead it just influencing in our favor the authority that has all the power. So it's like we're not doing anything productive. We're just playing the game and kissing ass to try and get in power. And so that's where all this productivity just ceases to exist, where it's like, what's the point of trying? And if I am going to try something, it's going to be to try to gain this guy's favor, not to develop something or innovate or work or get in a second job or any of these other things that I can't do in a free society. And so it's just a destitute, miserable lifestyle whenever someone else is in charge of your fortunes and your failures. And actually, this is where I'll end it. Jordan Peterson gives this example. I think it's in the first 12 rules for life, where he tells the story of, it might've been a poet or something writing the story of a woman goes to this therapist and describes how she has all these miserable things happening to her and how her life is horrible and how depressed and sad she is, and all of these terrible events and what a failure she is. And at the end of telling this depressing story, she says, but at least I hope it's my fault. And the therapist says, what do you mean? Why on earth would you want this to be your fault? She says, well, if it's God's fault, I can't do anything about it. Right? It just is. It just happened. I have to just accept it. But if it's my fault, at least that means I have some power to change the situation. And so that's that accepting that responsibility and seizing freedom and saying, I'm going to try to do something to make my lot better by actually doing something productive, as opposed to just trying to influence the authority over me. You know, if God did it, well, then God did it. What can I do? And so these are so wildly different in terms of what these societies look like. Not just in, we spent a lot of time on their monetary goods, on their production, on their technology, on their quality of life. And really just think about the psychic difference in terms of of hope and happiness and all of these things in life in these two different situations. I mean, they're dramatically different. That's Yeonmi Park talking about North Korea, and it's just hopeless. And there's no such thing as love or affection except for the party, compared to, you know, the hope of you can at least, there's always something, you can strive for more, you can do these other things. I mean, they're just so radically different. They're just so radically different. And why anyone would want to go for this other one, it's just like we've said, it's delusion or some type of pride that is just incomprehensible. Yeah. Sorry, that was a lot, but
no, it was all good. And that was an important series of, context taken from the chapter, because I think there's a really simple way, I think, to visualize that I thought of now. Visualize, when someone says they feel less defeated when they suffer a misfortune by cosmic chance or a cosmic force, and the suffering a defeat by some arbitrary power by design. I mean, think about it like a car accident. Right? I'm in a car. If anyone's ever been in a car accident, which I've been in like one, none of them were my fault, and this proves my point. Where I'm driving on the freeway, I'm not paying attention, little fender bender there. I feel awful, but in the end, I'm not going to necessarily crush myself, or it's not going to be like the worst thing in the world, or you're not going to be at least as upset about it, I suppose, although you'll be relatively upset. A different example would be someone, accidentally hitting you. Okay, this is going to make you a little bit more upset because it felt like it was out of your control, right? This is something someone else did, but still, it was a misfortune, bit of a cosmic injustice that, maybe this person can prevent that from happening. And then there's a next condition where let's say, drunk driver hits you. You feel pretty upset about that because that seemed a bit more intentional. That seemed like someone had to go out of their way to drink too much and then decide to get behind a wheel, and that's going to hurt, you, your family, your car, one of your possessions, and you're really, really upset. You're going to be much more upset at that example as compared to you making the mistake out of ignorance.
Yep.
Then there's even,
which loss do you think hits harder for a football team? One where they know they played poorly, like the Chiefs in the last Super Bowl, or one where there was some flagrantly terrible call by a ref that objectively cost them the game, right?
Ask the New Orleans Saints the last 2 years.
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
exactly. But it's like, which one of those, like, how does that impact you differently? In the one case, it's like, man, we got to play better, and you put it on you. The other one is like, just like you were saying, that resentment, and it's just there's no introspection, there's no growth from it.
Yeah. But I think there's even a good, example of even sticking on the car accident idea. I don't remember if it was Ford or some. No. You're good. It makes the point. But even in that situation, like if you, what is worse, the ref making a bad call of ignorance, or the ref making a bad call because you found out that he got paid from the other team?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
One of them's worse.
Or just not knowing. It's like he could have been paid. It's so flagrant. He might have been. And the point is that it directs all of the activity to that force and all of the mental, and none of it's to how can I play better next time. That's the difference between a Solzhenitsyn of like, how did I contribute to this? And just some resentment, socialist saying like, why don't I have enough? It's someone else's fault. You know what I mean? So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good. Car accident. Well, I think there's a good example of, and I don't remember who it was, what car company, but you could say Ford, GM, back in, I don't remember, it was like 60s, 70s, something like that. They let cars go off the line with specific failures and malfunctions that they knew of, that they knew that, it's going to go out there. There's a chance that these will fail and actually kill people, which it did. I don't remember if there's one like with a tire that actually was exploding and they knew about the defect, but they knew their bottom line said like, we can handle the lawsuits. It's going to be a less negative effect if we take care of the lawsuits by the small amount of injuries that this is going to cause compared to recalling all of these cars. So this is like an intentional, defect that went out there. So it seems very much like this authoritative power, providing you this car, manufacturing this car, purposely did something that they knew would hurt you, or at least had the chance of hurting you, but they did it anyways. It's like, well, in our plan, and I know some people are going to spin this like, well, that's a free market for you. Cause I always get that response. It's like, well, no, there's a law against it. I mean, that's the whole, the whole blind justice part that comes in, but it's the people who are wronged by that. And there are these people who died. Again, I can't think of the specific example, and I don't want to slander Ford or GM or whomever came out with it, but I think there's a few examples of this throughout, especially history and just all products. But they're like, we'll take the L on some people who's going to have their lives ruined because in our plan it fits in there. It still works out for us. It's better than this other option that we have that would cost us a lot more money.
We could stick with the anti-Nazi thing and just say it was Volkswagen.
Probably. Yeah. BMW. Yeah. So we jump into another idea that is one of those things that he's done 4 or 5 times already, where he comes up with this abuse of this word or term or idea that got switched over to a very similar sounding idea but comes with a different meaning behind it, or it's just a rebranding of this old really bad idea. And like at least once a chapter, maybe once every other chapter, he comes out with one of these. It's like, how was this book written in 44? Like it seems like it was written on Twitter like a couple of days ago is how it feels sometimes. So he hits you with another one of these right here when he talks about something called perfect equality and greater equality. So, quote, "There's only one general principle, one simple rule, which would indeed provide a definite answer to all these questions. Equality, complete and absolute equality of all individuals in all those points which are subject to human control. If this were generally regarded as desirable, quite apart from the question whether it would be practical, i.e., would it provide adequate incentives, it would give the vague idea of distributive justice a clear meaning and would give the planner definite guidance. But nothing is further from the truth that the people in general regard mechanical equality of this kind as desirable. No socialist movement which aimed at complete equality has ever gained substantial support. What socialism promised was not an absolute equal, but a more just and more equal distribution. Not equality in absolute sense, but greater equality is the only goal which is seriously aimed at." So there's this utopian idea of this perfect and absolute equality that is a known fallacy with anyone with a half functional brain. And when I talk about perfect and absolute equality, that means everyone gets the same stuff and 50 years later, these people given the same resources have the exact same outcomes. Obviously that's silly. There's no one who can tell you with a straight face they believe that unless they attended an Ivy League college. But then they switch the idea of creating greater equality, meaning the goal of having more equitable outcomes, which gets closer to that absolute equality, which gets closer to that utopia that they pretend to build. And this is the rallying cry of the modern day collectivists. You know, they cannot promise you this perfect utopia, but they can promise they can get you really, really close. And if you fight against people trying to get close to this perfect utopia, well, that makes you an evil person, right? So it's a double-edged sword. It's which they can say it's like, well, we're doing the best we can, and we want to get closer. We want more equitable outcomes, right? This equity movement right now. This is exactly what they're doing. It's exactly what Hayek described in 44, and it's happening at a massive rate right now.
Yeah, the absolute equality versus, you know, or absolute or greater equality versus equality. This is the equality versus equity conversation today. And the next quote, you know, is going to get into even just the description of it. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing I would add to it other than it, just like you said, this is one of those things where it's like these ideas aren't new, they're old. And even I think Hayek says, gosh, we're getting a lot of throwbacks from earlier in the book, but they're very old. They're some of the oldest ideas. They are regressive, and they're getting rebranded and polished, and people have just forgotten about, they haven't just forgotten what freedom is, but they've forgotten that we've been down this road before. We've had these debates before. I mean, that's why Hayek even wrote this book. He's like, we had these debates in Austria. We had these debates. We know where this goes. Right. And he's putting out the memo. He's like, these questions have been answered. What the hell are you guys doing? And it's like, here we are saying the same thing. It's like, Hayek answered these questions. Like, these people have answered these questions. And, you know, and we'll get to this, at least we'll touch on it in this chapter, where it's like, this can only happen in a society where people just have no robust familiarity with the past, no robust connection to historical events, historical ideas, to the efficacy of one idea versus another. Like, this is the only situation where we can have this happen, right? Like, if you lived in a town where every single person knew there was these poisonous snakes, you don't touch them, whatever, and some outsider shows up and is like, hey, do we touch the snake? It's like every person goes, no, don't touch that snake, right? No, don't touch that snake. But what if the next generation of kids that grows up and no adults tell them that, hey, those snakes are poisonous, or they act like the snakes don't exist? Then you're going to get a lot of kids maybe playing with those fucking snakes. And so it's like, that's what this is on an idea level. Obviously, that's a stupid metaphor off the top of my head. But the point is that when you have some connection to the past, when you have some connection, you know, that's one of the reasons a lot of I had this core group of friends from college, and a lot of my guy friends got married before I did. And I was very thankful. I would say, you know, there's that saying, it's like, you know, people learn from mistakes, but they don't have to be your mistakes, you know? And I was happy that, you know, I had my own fair share of mistakes for sure that I still, you know, make and I'm learning about, you know, as a husband. But there is a lot of mistakes my friends made that I didn't have to make because I watched them do it. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'll do my own fresh set of idiotic errors, but I won't do that. But that happens by having that connection through that trial and error process and that evolution type thing, you know? And there's, yeah, anyway, but that's where we get these same stupid arguments again and again, where it's, you know, it's Thomas Sowell debunking gender wage gap 50 years ago. It's like, this only happens in a society where certain people control the information and the next generation. I was one of them. Like I said, I was that dumbass, you know, saying that roads were socialism. Like, you know what I mean? And so it's like, I understand at a first-hand level, you know, where ignorance of where these ideas go. You know, that's the Marxist thing. Like, so many Marxist ideas have been received third and fourth hand, and they don't know where they come from.
Or they outright reject
or
that
where they
there's a
lead.
Connection there. Yeah.
Or where they lead, you know, which is more important. But,
yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, we've evolved medically from, you know, a lot of guess and check procedures to kind of knowing the procedure more intimately and being able to understand what to do and what not to do when we're maneuvering around inside the human body. This is like going back to before, you know, medical journals were around and just everyone had to guess and check as to how to do certain procedures. And it's like, no.
But the leech is here?
Exactly. Like shock therapy in the head, they're going to be fine. They'll drool a little bit, but at least they won't be screaming in the street. So yeah, it's just this, like, we refuse to learn. Like, ironically, the progressives do not acknowledge the progress we've made up to this point. It is very, very much regressive, going back to, again, it hasn't been tried yet. Like, I'm pretty sure he didn't shock him hard enough and he'd be completely fine. Right. So, yeah.
Real dictatorship hasn't been tried. Before you read this quote, I just want to tee this up. All right. So to those who are still listening, despite all of this is funny. This is the most organized outline we've ever had with the most deviations. This is so hilarious to me. But anyway, but to those, before you read this quote, everyone think the words equity versus equality, equity and equality.
But you got to say it in Bernie Sanders' voice.
Yeah. Equity and equality. And then listen to this quote and tell me this is not verbatim the equity equality thing.
Yep. Quote, these two ideals sound very similar. They are even though these two ideals sound very similar, they are as different as possible as far as our problem is concerned. This is not a quibble about words. We face here a crucial issue which the similarity of the terms used is likely to conceal. Perfect, right there. While agreement on complete equality would answer all the problems of merit the planner must answer, the formula of the approach to greater equality answers practically none. Its content is hardly more definite than the phrases common good or social welfare. It does not free us from the necessity of deciding in every particular instance between the merits of particular individuals or groups, and it gives us no help in that decision. All it tells us, in effect, is to take from the rich as much as we can. But when it comes to the distribution of the spoils, the problem is the same as if the formula of greater equality had never been conceived. Exactly. So, I mean, the part, especially when it says, all it tells us, in effect, is to take from the rich as much as we can. Like, literally read that in Bernie Sanders' voice, because that is him in a nutshell. Take from the rich and proclaim you're going to give to the poor.
Not me with my 3 lake houses.
Exactly. But really, that is Bernie Sanders' nutshell. Take from the rich and proclaim to give to the poor. The former is a compassionate but resentful cry to eat the rich, and the latter is of significantly less importance and requires no follow-up at all. And actually, you get scrutinized if you ever follow up on where does all this money we're taking from the rich going. But sure, they throw out the idea of greater equality or equity, but in reality, it's the same power grab we've seen through the 19th and 20th centuries, where they play on the emotions of all these angry and vulnerable people to build a mass movement to act on a greater, which will act as a greater emotional outlet for the frustration, but lacks all concern with actually fixing anyone's issue. And this goes into another book that I've read recently, as recommended by you, The True Believer by what's
Eric Hoffer.
Eric Hoffer. There we go.
Yeah,
I mean, if you read this book, read that book next if you haven't read it before. Just because
they're such great companion books.
They're great, and they're both easy reads, relatively short. But I mean, this is laying the foundation, which we've talked about in a conversation with someone else, laying the foundation for a frustrated future, a frustrated movement that is going to throw its frustrations, and all the frustrations are going to be pointed in the direction that won't help them. Right. So if people are frustrated because of their condition, their material condition in life right now, there's a lot of people who take advantage of that frustration and aim it toward, like, well, it's those capitalists that are making your material condition worsen every year and making this gap larger between the rich and the poor, because, you know, they're just stealing and hoarding all the money, as opposed to you getting really dumb degrees and stupid stuff that's not going to make you useful for any practical purpose in the future. Something we'll get to later as well. But I mean, the idea of just take from the rich, worry about that part for now. Resentment for the rich, but where the money goes, you know, we'll tell you, we're going to give it to people and give you some general ideas as to where it goes. But in reality, you know, it's going to go in my pocket as the powerful.
Kevin, it goes to the greater good. It goes to the social welfare. Who could argue with that?
I don't know.
You know, so this next part, I mean, I think the ideas from this chapter are very, like, flow really nicely and are coherent. And honestly, like, the remaining part was one that initially I was like, I don't really know how this fits. But then once we started looking at it through, like, the breakdown of society and, like, what happens, like, how do you manage the chaos once people start to realize that, oh, shoot, this is about who and whom, right? Once people start to realize, oh, who's going to plan whom? Am I going to be someone who is dictating the fates, or am I going to get dictated to? Those who are in charge are going to have to come up with some way to maintain their power. There's just going to be a lot of reactions. And so this next part, he gets into this idea of indoctrination of children, which I think that we'll probably touch more on whenever it comes to the chapter. I think the death of truth may be a different one, but but this was one of those quotes that was like, when we work on the outline, it's like, it feels like we can't not mention this, even if he expands on it later. But Hayek says it was not the fascists, but the socialists who began to collect children from the tenderest age in political organizations to make sure that they grew up as good proletarians. It was not the fascists, but the socialists who first thought of organizing sports and games, football and hiking in party clubs where the members would not be infected by other views. What an interesting way of putting it, where they see, those other views, by the way, are freedom, liberalism, respect for the individual.
All those awful things.
All those terrible things. And they're saying we don't want them to be infected by freedom. And so, there's a little bit we can say about that, but it's just, again, one of those things. We're seeing it today. This is the CRT debate. This is this thing where they're teachers don't want parents knowing what they're teaching in the classroom. This Howard Zenification of education, where it's like, yeah, they figured it out. They figured out, I mean, what is isn't there that Hitler quote that people have gotten in trouble for saying, like, unironically, where something about children are the greatest key to the future or something like that? Yeah. I'm going to look that quote up right now because it's actually amazing for this. Hitler quote, children. A child. So the state must declare. So my guess is people leave that out. But child is the most precious treasure of the living people. As long as the government is perceived as working for the benefit of the children, people will happily endure almost any curtailment of liberty and almost any deprivation. That's not the one. I think the one that says it's the most precious treasure of the people is the one that people quote. But the point is that Hitler understood that. I had never read it in its entirety, but there it is right there.
The fact that he
Hitler
uses children,
why you have to get to kids.
Yeah, the fact that he uses in that quote children as a means to curtail liberty, that should be super alarming, or curtail liberalism is crazy that people would go that far or think about it that way. But I think I like this quote. Small
here it is. It's he alone who owns the youth gains the future. So it's some kind of apocryphal thing where it's like children are the key to the future. Yeah. Sorry, I was like,
that actually perfectly does.
They get it.
Yeah, that perfectly goes into this because I think about some books like Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, where even though I'm not the biggest fan of Ayn Rand, she did make this point of all the planning leaders, the advocates for collectivism, made groups for young professionals to get together. They're playing cards or just a social group or something like that, but they all had socialist propaganda injected in there, and it instantly, it accomplished two things. It gave them the propaganda, these young minds of propaganda, to go out in the professional world and spread that propaganda, but it also insulated those people from the infestation of all these other ideas. So the kind of amazing thing here is, I don't know if Hayek would have seen that these clubs and organizations would now become fully accredited universities. I think he saw it in some way, but I doubt he would have pictured what we have now, where it is these universities that go under the name of academic freedom, or phrases like that, but are so illiberal and shut out so many ideas opposed to their progressive ideas. It's normally not even the university ideas. I think a lot of time it's the students' ideas. These young minds who are not fully developed and are coming here for an education, who get to dictate, what the university stands for. That they shut down views outside of themselves. So these have now become those organizations and clubs that were, spurring up in Hayek's time. So I think, if he'd see what would happen now, especially the university system, I think he'd be very, very disheartened.
Hayek would be, Hitler wouldn't.
Oh yeah. It was,
right? By indoctrinating the youth, they're playing this long game, and how they're indoctrinating them not just in their beliefs, but in what they think they're entitled to. That's kind of what this next part gets into, and how this resentment, like you talked about earlier with Eric Hoffer, where this comes from. Like it's not just, they don't just tell them to hate certain people. They create circumstances where they can be miserable or frustrated, and then they direct their frustration at these other entities and deflect it away from themselves, and then use that to fuel their own power.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps, but
no, that's perfect. I'm now thinking of the conversation we had, which by the time this comes out, our Benjamin Boyce conversation would have been released by now, but we do talk about that with him as to what happens when you create a future where you're manufacturing people who are not eligible for any practical positions, and now they're just going to build all that resentment and cause mass movement. So I think that's very intentional, although we kind of see it as, it's a unfortunate circumstance of all these kids wanting to branch out to different ideas. No, it's intentional. They're moving people in that direction. That's a 100%. So to continue here, though, the quote is, the resentment of the lower middle class, from which fascism and National Socialism recruited so large a proportion of their supporters, was intensified by the fact that their education and training had in many instances made them aspire to directing positions, and that they regarded themselves as entitled to members of the directing class. So directing class here is just an example of like the manager, like the people who, the larger professions, basically. That they thought they were going to get degrees in something that's relatively small, but at the time they finish their education, that they'd be able to move into fields that have larger influence, and with larger influence, normally a larger income. To continue, while the younger generation, out of that contempt for profit making fostered by by socialist teaching, spurned independent positions which involved risk, and flocked ever increasingly numbers into salaried positions which promised security, they demanded a place yielding them the income and power to which, in their opinion, their training entitled them. So again, in their opinion is kind of like, this is what I think. This is not like a market wage. This is what I think my wage should be. And that already there's a problem. It's like, no, you're getting paid according to what the consumer thinks you should get paid, basically. And their way of thinking is like, no, I should be able to dictate what I get paid, because the consumer doesn't need to consume anything. They only consume what the planners say they ought to consume. So it's very different than a real price mechanism there. To continue, while they believed in an organized society, they expected a place in that society very different from which society ruled by labor seemed to offer. So again, right there, they thought they would be at a higher post when they're getting out of education. They're figuring out that they're either at a low post or no post at all. And that's the problem, because it's a society ruled by labor, right? They were quite ready to take over the methods of the old socialism, but intended to employ them in the service of a different class. The movement was able to attract all those who, while they agreed on the desirability of the state controlling all economic activity, disagreed with the ends for which the aristocracy of the industrial workers used their political strength. So kind of to recap everything here, the young advocates of planning entered academic disciplines and industries and for positions that they thought would be of high value in the future. When this future never came, like who would have thought underwater basket weaving wouldn't be a huge hit right now? When this future never came after graduation,
studies,
because the market didn't, value their disciplines or their fields that they thought they're going to go into.
They worked so hard.
They became very resentful of not only, this is the important part. I think they became very resentful of not only the capitalists, this, free market society, but they got very resentful toward the old socialist order. To bring this to like a modern day context, think like I've said before, think of college graduates graduating with a gender studies degree or even HR, elementary education, or anything underpaid in an oversaturated market. And quickly find out their options are much more limited than they believed they thought they were going to be. Like, gender studies, I figured you can go into like mechanical engineering or something, you would have thought.
Sure.
So they believe that their position is undervalued because of the society ruled by labor, and didn't find, even though that society didn't find their skills to be very practical. This builds resentment towards the free market and towards the old guards of planners who did not create the future that they wanted. So now you have resentment coming from both ways. It's kind of, to me, like the fascists didn't like the communists didn't like the fascists, but they both agreed that they hated the liberals. So they're going to project their ire, even though it's a problem between those two groups. And really the socialism, the old socialist guard, is really what caused this problem. They're going to be frustrated at them, but they're going to use their tactics to point their hatred toward the capitalists. And so it's kind of like a brilliant technique as to, again, you read Eric Hoffer's book, how to build a mass movement and direct its ire toward, something else that's not going to fix the problem that created the frustration in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those quotes where it speaks exactly like you said. I mean, there's nothing to add. It's just, it speaks so much to this large group of people who are, every subsequent generation cranked out of higher ed is going to have more and more activists. This is one of the problems that I see whenever I say, look, we have a huge asymmetry with time right now, is that every year that passes, more activists are entering the workforce. And a lot of people blame it on the indoctrination in higher ed. And I think that that's valid. But it's not just that. It's not just that. And I'm not even sure that it's mostly that. I would say it's maybe 50% that. But it's like there's this broader underlying issue of where most people are told they have to go to college to get a degree in order to be successful. And they go to college, take out a bunch of loans. And like you said, most of these are oversaturated markets. A college degree was a sorting mechanism for a skill. And we saw this with business degrees. It used to be business degrees, and then you had to get your why am I drawing a blank on it? MBA was what became the new sorting mechanism. A business degree was the same as a high school diploma for a lot of people hiring business degrees. So you had to have an MBA, and then it became you have to have an MBA and maybe double major with economics or accounting and speak another language and stuff. So they just add more sorting mechanisms onto it. But it's the market, being students who are in higher ed, are way slow to catch up to that. So there's this lag where you have literally tens of thousands, if not more, of people that are getting these degrees. Like my cousin has a law degree, and he got a law degree thinking it'd be this big thing, and he had a hell of a time. I mean, just trying to even find a job. I don't know if he's a very good attorney. He doesn't watch this, so I'm fine saying that. He might not be, but the point is that even if you're a mediocre attorney, you should still be, that's a degree that we used to think was, people would say doctors and lawyers, right? Doctors and lawyers, you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And so it's like, I understand why he would want to go into that. And so you have these people that are graduating, and it's like, this isn't profitable. This isn't profitable. And so they're going to be pissed off. But the point is the same, where it's like, they think that they got these positions, and these positions entitle them to some kind of authority or some kind of wage or something that they think they deserve, and they don't. They just don't. And I think a lot of it also goes to where they just don't have a frame of reference. There are people who bitch about how they say teachers are underpaid or whatever. It's like, compared to what? Compared to what? You might be underpaid because you're living in a city where the cost of living is 3 to 4 times the national average, and you went into a job market where no one ever really gets fired unless they're a chimo perv or something. And everyone's getting these degrees. It's like, yeah, you're not super valuable. Like, they can pay you what they want to pay you because it's not merit pay. And then they say capitalism has failed. It's like, well, did capitalism fail? Like, no, you were lied to. Yes, but the capitalism didn't fail here. You failed to understand the market. A lot of that's information flow. That's a whole other thing. I don't want to ramble on about it, but
the only failure of capitalism here would be them offering a degree, like,
right,
in something so absolutely useless. Because the only downside, I suppose, of capitalism is if there's an audience for it, they're going to make something to entertain that audience, and that's
a really interesting point. And I think, gosh dang it.
I say it ironically.
No. When I say gosh dang it, I'm saying that because I was only going to read an excerpt of the next thing and then wrap it up. But what you just said gave me this thought, and I don't want to lose it, is that a degree is it's a promise, right? It's a promise of viability. So you're talking about capitalism. One of the failures of capitalism is it's like, the market determines. It's like, a degree actually is this barrier where it's a promise. I'm trusting you that the market says this is valuable. Like, I've said this before, one of my defenses of modern art, even just terrible, shitty, like performance art or whatever, is if someone wants to pay you for it, okay, where it's like, fine, but you have that immediate feedback of, am I going to get paid? Am I not? I'm a guy with a guitar. I go sit on the street corner. I strum some notes. Am I good? Are people putting money in the thing? Or if I sound like shit, they're probably not going to do it. Like, your labor has an immediate feedback mechanism with the market to whether or not what you're doing is valuable. So you can know Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about this, where he's like, talks about like a cab driver who is receptive and is anti-fragile, where it's like, look, the guy might have like month to month or even day-to-day wages, but he knows, okay, I sat on the street for 2 days. It used to be good. Now it's not. Now I know to go somewhere else. Like, he's really receptive to the market. He's adaptive. Adaptive is the word I'm looking for. A degree is not adaptive. It is a huge, huge overhead investment into something on the promise that it's viable without any input from the market in the meantime. That is the problem. That is the problem, is that they do not have the right information. And so of course they're pissed off. I mean, that's this article from Medium that I quoted about, where the woman says, of course my generation is going to be radicals and activists because capitalism failed us and we're locked out of the American dream. It's like, one of those statements is false, the rest is true. Something failed you. You are locked out of the American dream. You were lied to. I do not blame you for being an activist. I truly don't. I mean that as sincerely as anything else. But the thing they're pointing the blame at, like you said here, where it's like, well, they're resentful, and there's people helping guide their resentment towards the wrong thing, and it just keeps them distracted from ever actually doing anything about it. But that quote, this next section, I don't think we need to quote anything other than what you have in the bold here, which I agree with and I like, that ties into all this. You know, when you think about these activists, these people coming out of education, that realize that what they thought their life was going to be is very different in terms of monetary stability or, you know, physical comfort. They knew that the strongest group, which rallied enough supporters in favor of a new hierarchical order of society, and which frankly promised privileges to the classes which it appealed, was likely to obtain the support of all those who were disappointed because they had been promised equality but found they had merely furthered the interest of a particular class. So it's like, there are these fascists, these socialists, we'll just call them bad actors if we're going to map it onto today. These bad actors knew that all they had to do was rally the support of these groups who had been promised one thing and gotten another, and realized they had only furthered the interest of some other class. And it's like, well, but what other class? Well, it's the capitalists in this situation. And so it's like you've mentioned Hoffer a few times, and I agree with all of it. They just learned to harness resentment, and which again, I think it's really important. And this is where one place where I think the right fails, to say that their resentment, or at the very least their frustration, to quote Hoffer, is not misplaced. This is not some ginned up thing. This is not some like made up snowflake, oh my God, my life is so hard kind of thing. It's like, I'm not saying your life is hard or miserable compared to someone in a gulag, you know, in the mid 20th century, but to say that you now have $160,000 in debt, you're living in a place that has an incredibly high cost of living, you will never get a home loan, you can't find a job outside of Starbucks, you might have to move in with your parents. This idea of healthcare, being on your parents' healthcare until 26 makes sense to you because no job you get actually offers decent healthcare. It's like, it's one thing to say that you're worse off than anyone else in human history. Okay, that's obviously false. It's another thing to say you have nothing to be pissed off about. That's a lie. You have something to be pissed off about, and you are ripe for someone to say, trust me with the power, right? Take from the rich as much as you can, you know, like the Bernie thing you quoted earlier. And then the cycle just continues. It just creates a new aristocracy. You know, all you do is you're just putting your support behind these other people who they become the haves. And this whole ideology just changes the haves and have nots in some ways, but it always leaves large groups of people completely out in the cold, especially the true believers.
Yeah. The quote we had earlier about the poor man and at that point, Britain is better, more well off than the, you know, relatively rich or middle-class man in Germany or Russia. You know, I think it applies a bit here, but in a different way. I think it's obvious that the poor, middle class, and rich man today is better off than the poor, rich, or middle class man of, you know, 1944. We have better technology, we have better medical advances, we have all these things, but strapped down with all those other, you know, problems like, you know, $100,000+ of student loan debt, no ability, no choice to buy property, no ability to do a lot of these different things because you're kind of squeezed into this hole. The problem between the rich poor man, or whatever you want to label it now, compared to 1944 is there's less avenues for choice, which provides less meaning. So that's what we've talked about, I think, in the previous two chapters, is about this ability to choose your path is really what's providing meaning. When you don't have that ability, the meaning goes away, which is why I think we're turning into a decadent society. That's, we have all these wonderful things, but somehow there's meaning lost somewhere. Somehow we're on social media connected to 7 billion plus people, but we feel more alone than any time before.
Yeah.
It's the lack of meaning that we're starting to get, instead of just material goods, because now we've kind of transcended to the point where everyone in America has the fortunate reality of getting all of these basic necessities available for a relatively low cost. That doesn't help you when you don't see yourself having a choice in your own life. And you always see there's some exterior force, whether that be the government or whether that be just some other form of, oppression of being under a mountain of debt or something like that, or being led in the wrong direction, which I think is most of the cases now. Is you finish college, you had this picture of what it would be after you finish university, and it's just not that. You don't have the choices. That degree you talked about, that promise, is no longer there. It was a false promise.
Yeah.
So people are frustrated. People are severely lacking meaning today, and that is what creates a poor man in 2021. Is the lack of meaning, not material.
That's Michael Malice talks about this, where he says people always want to equate right now to 1984, and he says it's probably much closer to Brave New World, where we just have all these pleasure devices to keep us distracted. I mean, I think Ready Player One does a good job of highlighting that same kind of thing. That movie Surrogates, crappy movie with Bruce Willis, but it's still the meaning there. Wall-E, where it's like, it's just about distraction with, luxury, and just let us take care of the rest.
So Michael Knowles in his new book actually mentions the exact same thing, compares 1984 to A Brave New World, and says, the Brave New World is definitely more accurate as according to the future that they could have predicted.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's good. You want to get to the main takeaways?
Let's get to the main takeaways, man. This was this flew by for sure.
Yeah, it did. This is it's so funny how this was so organized, and we just went. But
we have more, and we can talk about this after. We have more notes here than vast majority of chapters, but we have like a half hour left for the 2 hour mark, so it's pretty impressive. But talk about that later. Sure. So the first takeaway that we have from chapter 8 is, up to this point, Hayek talks a lot about democracy, the economy, and general freedom, but now he gets into like the real breakdown of society. He shows you how all of these things apply. So there's actually a lot of themes in this chapter that was repeated, but it was repeated in a very profound, organized way that kind of led you to understand, oh, this is why. I mean, you understood why it was a problem before, but it's like, oh, this is how we see it applied, and how we're seeing this horrible breakdown. So, planning doesn't end in the economic sphere, something we've talked about before, or just control what we consume and produce, but it controls every aspect of us living our lives, including whether or not we're worthy of contributing to society in any meaningful way. Again, we talk about meaning right here. There's nothing much worse than saying, all right, I can't control what I eat. I can't control, what I do in my leisurely time, what we talked about in the previous chapter, but it really, really is awful when, the centralized coercive authority says, we don't value you enough to even hold a position that you want, or we don't even value enough for you to be in the workforce at this point. And there's a lot of people out of the workforce right now. We just came out of a pandemic where, the government shut it down. So, they had to literally take the job away from them, and it feels different when you have a centralized authority doing that. Another point is, one way we were able to do this is that in the West, including the time of Hayek was writing this, enough people had forgotten what unfreedom means, that term unfreedom, to possess the necessary perspective to see the danger in these so-called plans. We don't see what that means anymore, and future generations are forgetting what that looks like, because they assume that freedom is the default condition in our brains, where they don't see it as a risk and a responsibility.
Right. Well, and even just like, if you were to take, let's say, one example of what unfreedom or what a different society looks like, it's like, okay, I mean, you can expand out and out and out. If you hit too many red lights in a day, you're pissed off. Yeah. What about if you get a flat tire? Or what about if your car is broke down? Just think about these little things of, oh, my cell phone broke. Or, oh, the power went out for like 10 hours or something, you can just take it's like this one thin slice of just how fragile and how vulnerable and how much we take for granted all of the things that create our material comfort today. I mean, look at whenever all those idiots bought, toilet paper at sorry if you're one of them, anyone who's watching, but at the grocery store with COVID, when you see the supply lines break down where it's like, just, we have no idea how little of our own material wealth we produce as individuals. This is one of the things I loved about doing survival stuff and going out and, building my own shelter and boiling my own water and procuring my own food and stuff, where it's like, literally you're responsible for every single drop of it, where it's like, if I just feel like having a lazy day, I don't have water. Just think about that. Like the process of me going down to a lake or to a river and getting water and bringing it back and multi-filtering it and multi-boiling and putting other, like, it just for me to have clean water for the day, oftentimes is like 2 hours, And so it's just like all of these things for people just don't like, it's like, I flip a faucet, I flip a light switch and water and light, and they take it all for granted, like you said, because, and the point is they've forgotten what unfreedom is. They've forgotten, and often, in their defense, these generations, it's not that they've forgotten, they just don't know. They have not been made acquainted with those types of situations. Yeah, and the bad actors exploit that, and they're the ones orchestrating it oftentimes. But anyway, continuing wrapping it up, like, just once people understand that we're in this whom kind of thing, once, like you were saying, like, they're not just controlling the economic sphere, everything is going to be controlled. You're going to have a cascade of like societal reactions here, where different people are trying to vie for, I would rather be the one dictating than being dictated to. And so once they realize that the extent of control exercised by the planners, again, not just these economics or common good, but rather all of human life, they begin to scramble around and try to do whatever they can to be in a position of power. If you think about like in the Soviet era, where it was, you've mentioned death to Stalin a lot of times, where it's like people are informing on each other and they're just paranoid and looking over each shoulder and just trying to not have a target on their back, or, put a target on someone else's back. It's like, if I spent an entire day running around trying not to get shot, what productive thing did I do other than not get shot? By the way, I'm not saying not getting shot is not an unproductive thing. It's, if you're in a situation where that's your biggest threat, it's the most productive thing you can do. And that speaks to the different circumstances in a free society versus a planned society. And one of those things,
and there is sorry, I didn't mean to derail you. One of those things is like, you talk to people, you worry about the information you give them. Where in a scenario like that movie, and what was common in the Soviet Union is you're more worried about what not to say to them while you're talking to them.
Really good.
And that's really a complete reversal of the natural like order of how we communicate with each other. And that's got to be just mind blowing to have to think about that all the time.
Yeah. Well, again, that's another thing that that Yeonmi Park talks about whenever she's like, I went from North Korea where I was terrified about saying the wrong thing. And then I was in American University and I literally had the exact same feeling, where it's like, anyway, but you're right. Self-censorship is very different. It's one thing to say, I'm worried about, having wrong information or not knowing what I'm talking about. It's another thing entirely where it's like, if I say the wrong thing, you're going to use this to turn me in and I'm going to spend, 10 years in the gulag. They had a word for it. I can't remember what it is that Solzhenitsyn talks about, where it's like, there was a term where it's like, this is the thing, that everyone has, that everyone's trying to avoid. But so the point is, there's no trust. Like, there's no meaning. There's no purpose. Like you said, it destroys this society, completely breaks down. And part of that breakdown is, it's like, there's these bait and switches, like, what leads to a breakdown of society more quickly than a complete breakdown of language and understanding of each other. Having different definitions of words, switching things like equality and equity and all these other things, and having like these linguistic rhetoric games, which we're seeing right now. I think it's no accident that in the biblical story about the Tower of Babel, is God confused their languages and sent them to different parts of the earth It's like, even if he didn't send them to different parts of the earth, confusing the languages is the most important thing, right? And so it's like, you see this happening. The planners are creating this chaos, confusing the languages, and having these rhetorical tricks that keep people confused, keep them pissed off at each other, keep them in support of an agenda that they might not actually support because they think they're saying one thing. Like, how many people, here's a question for you, Kevin. How many people do you think today, even today, I'm not even saying 6 months ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, today, use the word equity and think they're using the word equality? What percentage of the US population?
Man. The people who actually use that, or even, I wouldn't even say the people who use it, the people who look at a sign
Advocate.
saying, not even advocate, people who look at a sign and say racial equity on it and don't like bat an eye and don't say like, oh, that's straight from Orwell. Like, that's 95% of people, I would say, upwards of 95% of people. Because there's people like you and I who understand this is a red flag. And then there's the average person, Trump supporter, even in a lot of cases, who will look at that and like, whatever, not like, doesn't like, even if it's like, doesn't even tug at you in any way, reading that and being like, oh, that's stupid. It's like, no, that's evil. That's evil right there. You got to treat
the success of programs called diversity, inclusion, and equity, just on their face, tells you the ignorance of people to what these words mean, right? Like, that right there is like case in point. It's like, these programs are actually have the word in the name of the program, in the name of the initiatives, right? And how many people that were saying, yeah, we do need that. That's why that quote is so huge that Hayek says, it's like, they sound similar. They sound similar. This is not a quibble. This is night and day difference between these things. So the point is that this is one of the things that happens. And I think one of the themes of this chapter is the breakdown of society and how people react and how people respond and who's orchestrating the breakdown and so on and so forth. And part of that is this linguistic game. And they'll use these words like equity. They'll use these words like the greater good or the social welfare or social justice or equity, and even or even they'll use equality sometimes. They'll even use that, and it ends up completely destroying everything because they want to bend to that over everything else. And it just brings it back to that Lord Acton quote, from the very beginning, where it's the finest opportunity ever given to the world was thrown away because the passion for equality made vain the hope for freedom. People are more than happy to give away their freedom, or at least neglect it, in the names of these vaguely defined things, or these things they've been misled to support. And it's all just, and what happens to that freedom? Like, if you're to quantify freedom, like if I did have 100 and now I have 30, that 70 went somewhere. Went to the planner, went to the planner.
Yeah. And that quote, there's a few buzzwords in there, like, equality and freedom. But I think the most important word in that quote is, so to read it again, the finest opportunity ever given to the world was thrown away because of the passion equality made vain the hope for freedom. The most important word to me right there is opportunity. People don't look as freedom as an opportunity.
Interesting. Yeah.
No, like, freedom should be seen as an opportunity for you to express yourself and make own choices. But when people try to reverse that and say we have an opportunity to create equity, that's not opportunity, that's tyranny.
Yeah.
That hurts freedom. That's a net negative on freedom. So I think when people, read this quote, and I'm honestly reading it differently than I did at the beginning, which is why I thought it was a good idea to read it at the beginning and read it at the end. I'm reading it completely different now. That look at this freedom, look at this American experiment as an opportunity. Don't look at it as an obstacle, because then you're just going to throw away that opportunity for some utopia you think you can achieve if you were just powerful enough.
Yeah. And the thing about opportunity is it's a form of chaos, right? It's uncertitude. It's not certain, but it's possibility.
Yeah.
And what's the alternative? No possibility, right? Or possibility only given or retracted from that new aristocracy of benevolent planners who were the type of psychopath that you wouldn't want to trust, with the authority to govern, 5 square feet of sidewalk, right? Let alone all of society. So anyway, that's all I got, man. What do you got?
That's it, man. If you like this, I think this episode number 7, covering chapter 8. So we have 6. We're releasing them every Monday right now as our schedule. And we're chugging along, 15 chapters total, and we're gonna do a conclusion episode at the end. So make sure to go back, listen to the other ones if you haven't already. Make sure to listen to future ones if you're listening to this in the future, futuristic people in your flying cars. But just to give us a follow, you can follow Truman on by going to returntoreason.locals.com to join his locals community, doing a bunch of new and exciting stuff there. So make sure to join it and join all the fun. Also, you can look for Return to Reason on YouTube, ThinkSpot, and Medium for written content, and then go to @MyMundaneMind on Twitter.
Yeah, that's right. And I have to say, I will say it while we're recording, is in the last episode, I said, why didn't you plug my locals? After you did that, and you absolutely had. I was just a dumbass, and
what was it? And the South African president,
yeah.
Biden.
Where am I? What?
Every
day I wake up wondering how I'm president. So do the rest of us. So anyway, thank you, and I apologize. I should have never doubted you. And same with Kevin. Follow him on locals, engineeringpolitics.locals.com. ENG_politics on Twitter, YouTube, engineering politics. And did I miss ThinkSpot, right? Engineering politics.
Yeah, ThinkSpot.
All of those.
Twitter, ENG_politics, which you might already said.
I did. It's okay. It's okay. I'm owed one. I'm owed one.
All right, now we're even.
Follow Kevin. We were talking about this before we started recording. Kevin is criminally under subbed on YouTube, criminally under followed on Twitter. So seriously, follow him, or you're dead to me. Or you're dead to me, as if that means anything to anyone. But
I wouldn't
follow
I have on Twitter, but oh well.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you everyone for watching. We will see you next time, and I guess that's it.
Peace.